Hi guys, have you heard the sad news that Jacqueline Van Maarsen has died? If you don't know, Jacqueline Van Maarsen was best friends with Anne Frank. They were best friends from school, and she has just died, and it's the last person in Anne Frank's life that was still living, who two now have gone, who was mentioned in the diary and was a very big part of her life. And so it's really, really sad, but she also wrote a book. So you've got the Diary of Anne Frank. If you haven't read this, I'd really, really recommend it. It will teach you about justice. Anne Frank was a real deep thinker, very free-spirited though as well. She was known as the fun one in her family. She had these big dreams of being an actress or a writer, traveling the world. She had so much big thoughts on things like feminism, which wasn't really spoken about much then, and God and faith and nature, and so many like quotes like, don't think about the misery but the beauty that still remains. And realizing when she was writing this book, she was literally in hiding from the Nazis he didn't want her to live. And she talks about extensionism in it, and about having hope to live, and you know, it's such a good book because she's 13 when it starts, and she's actually not in hiding yet, and then it ends when she's 15 and she's just taken to the death camp. She did not survive the war, sadly, as did many people. She is a way for a lot of people learning about justice and learning about putting yourself in someone else's shoes, because you're reading it in first person and it's her story. And she was a very likable, inspirational person. But her best friend, she talks about in the diary, called Jopie, she wrote a farewell letter to her in the diary. So Anne Frank actually did die February or March 1945. Obviously they can't work out the exact date, because it was before the camp was liberated. But Jacqueline now has just died, her friend Jackie, February 2025, 80 years later, to literally the same time. And just thinking, she got that, and Anne should have had that, she should have had that. But Jacqueline Van Maarsen also wrote a book called A Friend Called Anne. She spoke about her experiences. She wanted to do a book. This was actually a book for children. She says in it, one day while talking to children about my experiences during the Second World War and about my friendship with Anne Frank, a small boy asked me, why didn't you just fly away in an aeroplane? I then suddenly realised how difficult it must be for young children living at the beginning of the 21st century to understand what it was like living in Holland in the 1940s during the German occupation, a situation without freedom. We were prisoners in our own country. Anne Frank's diary leaves a very strong message, a message directed against discrimination. It shows the results when discrimination against ethnic groups other than our own is pushed to extremes. The only way to avoid such catastrophes from happening again is to inform young people about what happened during the war. One cannot work on the future without knowledge of the past. Anne Frank became a legend, and having been Anne Frank's best friend, I became a part of that legend. That's why I wrote a book about this friendship and give talks about her fate and the fate of others. So Carol Ann Lee told the story for children, so it's not, but with her world, so she helped retell it for her. Obviously now, with everything going on in Palestine and with like international court of justice, war criminals still being supported by the UK and the USA, Jacqueline Van Maarsen died at a time when genocide is somehow accepted in some respects, and we need to learn about things like the Diary of Anne Frank. We need to learn about this period of time, because everyone should be able to live their life. But the thing that made me, so when I heard Jacqueline Van Maarsen had died, because I read the Diary of Anne Frank, was very influenced and inspired by justice and inspired by Anne Frank's character of have hope and optimism even in the most awful situations to help get you through. But when I heard Jacqueline Van Maarsen had died, Anne Frank's best friend, the last living person in the world, really, to be close to her, it made me really, really sad. But then straight away, it actually made me slightly happy. I believe in the afterlife. I believe that we do see our friends again in the afterlife. But it's because of the end of this book, A Friend Called Anne, where she said, at home again, when filming for the documentary was over, she was in a documentary about Anne Frank, Jacqueline remembered something Anne had written in a short story about wanting to be a movie star. One way or another, everyone will know my name later. The thought sent a shiver through Jacqueline, and she turned to Anne Frank's diary for comfort. She found it there in a few short lines that took her back to those happy days when they had first met at school and their wonderful friendship began. Well then, Jackie, I hope things go well with you, that I hear from you soon, and that we'll meet again soon. Your best friend, Anne. P.S. I hope that we'll always stay best friends until we meet again. The last words in the diary are, we will, Anne, I promise, Jacqueline said softly, and closed the book. And the fact that now they have met again, their souls have been reunited, that's what I believe. And it's really, really sweet. Jacqueline was actually the only one who wasn't shocked by what Anne wrote in the diary. Anne wrote about things in detail, in lots of different respects, and people were surprised. They sort of took her for granted a bit, like she was the baby in her family, and they were like, oh, Anne's always just playing around. And Otto Frank was surprised by what she wrote in the diary, as were her other friend Hannah Gosser, who's now also sadly gone. But Jacqueline Van Maarsen was the only person who wasn't shocked by what Anne said, because she'd spoken to her, as they were so close friends that they'd spoken to each other about what they wanted to do with their lives and, you know, everything like that. And so that was amazing. I mean, she also wrote a farewell letter in hiding to her friend Joby, who's now just gone 80 years later. I mean, that's crazy. But Anne Frank, Jacqueline Van Maarsen also, she was actually became a bookbinder. She had children and grandchildren. So I'm thinking about them. I'm really sorry for them losing their family member. She also speaks about after the war and the liberation and what actually happened. So it's really, really interesting. When Jacqueline Van Maarsen found out that Anne Frank hadn't survived the war, in this book she says why she wanted to scream, why this been allowed to happen. She felt as though she'd been hit, her throat closed up and her limbs became stiff. The thought of Anne, bright, lively, laughing Anne, the young girl with sparkling eyes who was broken by typhus and starvation, made Jacqueline feel as though nothing would ever be right again. Anne had done no one any harm, and she had so much to offer the world. She might have got married and had children of her own. She might have become a successful writer, but now all that potential, Anne's gift for living, had been wiped out. The Nazis saw only the fact that she was Jewish, and inflamed by hatred as senseless as it was dangerous, they decided that this was reason enough to kill her. And with what's going on in the world now, it is so important that we keep remembering the stories like Anne Frank, and the fact that everyone in Anne Frank's life is now gone just shows that, you know, we need to learn from history, because the voices who can tell us about that time are going now. Eva Skloss, Anne Frank's stepsister, is still in the world. There was a whole thing about this because Anne Frank's friend said she never met Eva. Otto Frank married afterwards, and it was their daughter. She says she knew Anne Frank, but most of the people, I mean, Jacqueline Van Maarsen obviously was the closest friend she had. So the fact that she's gone, we need to remember, especially with things getting accepted in this world, we need to remember what can happen if racism goes unquestioned. We have Donald Trump at the moment basically saying that, you know, talking about like almost taking over countries, and we have to learn about what Hitler was doing and the invasions and stuff, and you know, we need to learn from history so we don't repeat it. And the problem is, as we get further away, we're not learning as much. But I was so sad to hear about Jacqueline Van Maarsen's death, because the fact that the last thing she says in her book is we will meet again, I promise, as what Anne said to her, and the fact that their souls are now met 80 years after, yeah, just something really bittersweet, emotional.